It's always a delight. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Bashir Abu Manni. I always say, I write it down so I never forget it. I have to say my name. I'm head of School of English. I'm also co-director of the Center for the Global Study of Empire. So this is the Center's second keynote speaker event this year. The Center is here to promote critical discussions of empire, to examine and understand its histories, its legacies, and also its contemporary practices, and of course to tackle difficult questions about issues that exercise public attention and need sober and rational thinking. So this is my segue into introducing critical and sober thinking. So I'm particularly delighted that Kenan Malik is here with us today. Thank you for coming all the way. He is, without question, one of Britain's leading public intellectuals in a country that doesn't really do public intellectuals, unlike the French. But he is one of this country's leading public intellectuals. His column in The Observer spreads what for me are the virtues of politically committed writing, critical analysis, wading through jargon, skepticism, moral relativism to boot. His new book, Not So Black and White, sits among a list of books on various questions related to public and political philosophy, challenging contemporary issues that he tackles, like immigration and Islamic fundamentalism. It's a book on the Rushdie fatwa, which is, I presume, is selling again for the wrong reasons, but there you have it. Kenan will speak for around 45 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to questions. I'll have a mic, so I'll be going around and sort of insisting on questions rather than just statements. So I'll be hovering around you as you're asking the question. And so we'll have enough time to do that. Please join me in welcoming Kenan Malik to the stage.
Thanks, Bashir. And thanks to the university and to the Centre for Empire for inviting me here. It's a pleasure and honour to be here. Never been to Canterbury before, so that's weird. Let me begin with a quote from Frantz Fanon. "The Negro is not any more than the white man." He wrote that in his 1952 masterpiece, Black Skins, White Masks. And he was making an argument about the illusory character of racial categorization. The Negro is not any more than the white man. And yet, more than 70 years after Fanon wrote those lines, they still feel unsettling, as if they were a challenge not just to racialization, but to our identity, our very being. And that they should do so poses, I think, exposes, in a sense, the deeply conflicted relationship we have with the idea of race. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. We live in an age in which in most societies there is a moral abhorrence of racism, albeit that in most bigotry and discrimination still disfigure the lives of many. We also live in an age which is saturated with identitarian thinking, with the placing of people into racial and ethnic boxes. And the more we despise racial thinking, the more we seem to cling to it. And that's the paradox, really, that I want to talk about tonight. And to do that, I want to retell the history of both of the idea of race and of the struggles to confront racism and to transcend racial categorization, and to look at the intersection between the two, between the history of race and the struggles against ideas of race and racism. And in retelling that history, I want to challenge some of the ways in which we think both of race and of anti-racism. Race is a modern concept. That's not to say that prejudices or the categorization of human groups were not deeply rooted in the pre-modern world. On the contrary, notions of difference and inequality were integral to the pre-modern consciousness. Paradoxically, that's why such prejudices are a long way from modern notions of race and racial categorization. Only in a world in which the principles of social equality and a common humanity have become accepted can ideas of inequality and racial difference gain true meaning. And that was the world that was slowly coming into being in 18th century Europe, in particular through the Enlightenment. Now, there's perhaps no period of history that's been more debated and contested than the Enlightenment. For some, it is the foundation of modern ideas of liberty, equality, and tolerance. For others, the source of modern racism and bigotry. The Enlightenment was not, however, a singular blob with a singular set of views or ideals. It was cut through with conflicts and contradictions. It was an age in which ideas about equality and a common human nature became widely accepted. It was also an age of slavery and colonialism. Many Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Hume, Voltaire, Jefferson, Kant, combined a defense of liberty and equality with racist attitudes and often an acceptance of slavery. And what we see in that is the beginning of a contradiction that would shape the social consciousness of the modern world. The contradiction between an abstract belief in equality and the reality of a deeply unequal world. Race came to be the way of making sense of that contradiction. Emerging capitalist societies had destroyed many of the old divisions, but they had created new ruptures, not simply between Europeans and non-Europeans, but also fault lines of race, class, rank within European societies themselves, divisions that seemed as permanent as those of the pre-modern world. And over time, they came to be seen as ineradicable, as natural, as racial. There is a common assumption that racism emerges when members of one race begin discriminating against members of another, that racism is what develops when races collide. I want to argue that the opposite is the case. Race did not give birth to racism. Racism gave birth to race. The ancestors of today's African Americans were not enslaved because they were black. They became classified as a distinct and inferior race as a means of justifying their enslavement. Race was not a concept consciously forged to explain away enslavement or social inequalities. Rather, as social divisions acquired a status of permanence, so differences presented themselves as if they were natural, not social. By the end of the 18th century, the concept of race had found a foothold in European intellectual circles. Yet racial thinking remained marginal. A key reason was the significance of equality as a defining feature of Enlightenment thought. And if the arguments of figures like Locke, Hume, Voltaire, Jefferson, Kant represents one strand of thinking about race and equality, the beliefs of a figure like the French philosopher Denis Diderot represents a very different strand. Diderot was deeply hostile to slavery and colonialism. He dismissed the idea that non-Europeans were savages because their forms of governance, religion, and moral norms were different from those of Europeans. He asks about colonialists, "Tell me, reader, do you see here civilized people arriving among savages or savages being received by civilized people?" In this contrast, lies the distinction between what many now call the mainstream and moderate Enlightenment. On the one hand, the moderate mainstream Enlightenment, on the other hand, what we now call the radical Enlightenment. The mainstream Enlightenment consists of figures with whom we're most familiar and about whom historians have most written. It was, however, the radical Enlightenment, shaped by lesser-known figures such as Diderot, D'Holbach, Spinoza, that truly gave substance to arguments about equality and emancipation. And the struggle between the mainstream and the radicals was key in shaping the character of the Enlightenment and in framing subsequent debates about race and colonialism all the way down to this day, as we shall see. As well as the battle between the liberals and the radicals over the meaning of universalism, there was also in the post-Enlightenment world a challenge to the very idea of universalism. And perhaps the most important thinker in developing the anti-universalist argument was the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, a seminal figure straddling the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment worlds. His concept of culture still shapes much thinking today. For Herder, what made each people or nation or folk unique was its particular history, culture, and modes of living. To be a member of a folk was to think and act in ways given by the folk. A culture could only be understood in its own terms, and to remain authentic, every culture had to be protected from outside encroachment. Herder was a staunch supporter of equality, an opponent of slavery and colonialism. Nevertheless, his cultural relativism and his celebration of the authenticity and singularity of cultures led him to deeply repulsive, indeed racist views. He abhorred migration and mixed marriages, which he said were strongly detrimental to the beauty or uniqueness of a people. In the 20th century, as we shall see, Herder's pluralism and celebration of cultural difference became the root of much anti-racist thinking. Yet in the 19th century, Herder's ideas flowed also into racial thinking. Because once it was accepted that different peoples were motivated by different sentiments, unique to themselves, that these sentiments imbued a people's history, tradition, and consciousness, it was not a great step to view these sentiments as racial. This dual character of Herderian pluralism, the celebration of cultural pluralism, the celebration of what became racial thinking, still plagues us to this day. By the second half of the 19th century, the racialization of social divisions had acquired both the stamp of scientific truth and the status of common sense. The concept of a racial type, as it developed through the 19th century, was of a group of people linked by a set of fundamental characteristics and differing from each other by virtues of those attributes. These included not just mental and physical traits, but also social needs, aspirations, and value. One's being, one's identity, determined one's moral and social place in the world. Here, long before the phrase was coined, was the original politics of identity. We think of identity politics as something relatively new, something on the left. What I want to argue, what I want to show is that the origins of identity politics lie in the late 18th century, and they lie on the reactionary right. And the first politics of identity was the concept of race. We also think today about race in terms of skin color or continent of origin, black, white, Asian, and so on. But race was a very different concept in the 19th century. It was a question not just of skin colour, but primarily of social differences. It may be difficult to comprehend now, but for 19th century thinkers, the working class was as racially distinct from the middle class as blacks were from whites, and also possessed the same traits as blacks did. There's a vignette of working class life in the London newspaper, the Saturday Review. The Bethnal Green poor, it wrote, are a race of whom we know nothing, adding that the distinctions and separations, like those of English classes, offer a very fair parallel to the separation of slaves from whites. It wasn't just in newspapers or popular culture. Sociologists developed the argument that class divisions were in reality racial divisions. Lester Ward, the first president of the American Sociological Association, wrote that the genesis of society has been through the struggle of races. The conquering race looks down with contempt upon the conquered race and compels it to serve it in various ways. Here for Ward lay the origins of social class. And not just for Ward, for a whole coterie of sociologists and anthropologists of the time. And not just the working class, but many populations, now seen as white, were not viewed as white 150 years ago. The Irish, Jews, Slavs, Southern Europeans were all seen as distinct races and often as non-white. Race, in the contemporary sense, and whiteness as we understand it, emerged only in the early decades of the 20th century, propelled by two developments: the coming of democracy and a new imperialism, exemplified by the scramble for Africa. As Western nations became more democratic, with the eventual extension of the suffrage to the whole adult population, so the racial view of the working class, which had dominated 19th century elite consciousness, slowly faded from public view. The widening of suffrage coincided with the expansion of imperial rule in a frenzy of land grabbing by European nations from Africa to the Pacific. And in a coincidence of democracy and imperialism, racial thinking evolved from being an elite ideology to becoming part of popular culture in a way that it hadn't previously. And the language of race became much more refocused on skin colour. Whiteness was now extended to all classes and most Europeans. That's the notion of race we still have today. But the fact that we still view race in this fashion should not blind us to the fact that it has not always been so, and that our perception of race is a product of centuries or a couple of centuries of social negotiation and conflict. If much of this history of race has been forgotten, so is much of the history of the challenge to racism and to racial categorization. Until relatively recently, radicals challenging inequality and oppression did so in the name not of identity, but of a universalism that fueled the great radical movements that have shaped the modern world, from anti-colonial struggles to the movements for women's suffrage to the battles for gay rights. That universalism was best expressed in the Haitian Revolution of 1791, a revolution which revealed both the necessity for and the shortcomings of the Enlightenment. It was one of the three major revolutions of the 18th century, but one which, when compared to the place that the American and French revolutions occupy in our culture, is barely remembered. Yet it was through the Haitian Revolution, in which the slaves of the French colony of Saint-Domingue dismantled their chains and declared eventually an independent nation, Haiti, that the emancipatory logic of Enlightenment universalism was for the first time seen through to its revolutionary conclusion. The French revolutionaries, who had overthrown the old regime in 1789 in the name of the rights of man, refused to apply those rights to their colonies. Slavery was maintained, as was colonial rule. It was the 12-year-long revolution that transformed the meaning of universal rights, forcing the French to abolish slavery, first on Saint-Domingue and then in all French territories. In a sense, slaves had compelled French revolutionaries to take seriously their own revolutionary ideals. In the debate over the Enlightenment, supporters and critics both presented as a peculiarly European phenomenon. For one, a demonstration of the greatness of Europe. For the other, a reminder that its ideals are tainted by racism and colonialism. It seems to me that both miss the importance of the non-European world in shaping many of the ideals we associate with the Enlightenment. It was through the struggles of those denied equality and liberty by the elites in Europe and America that ideals of universalism were truly invested with meaning. Early historians of the Haitian Revolution, most notably C.L.R. James in his groundbreaking work, The Black Jacobins, placed much emphasis on the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in shaping the attitudes of slave insurgents. More recent accounts have downplayed or ignored that revolutionary ideology, stressing instead factors such as religion and the African cultures from which the slaves had been snatched. This contrast reflects in part the accumulation of new research, but it also reflects the broader aims of historians and the changing relationship of radicals to the Enlightenment. James published The Black Jacobins in 1938 in a period of intense anti-colonial struggles, when radicals still looked to Enlightenment ideals as the foundation of progressive movements. In the decades that followed, disenchantment with the Enlightenment became more entrenched and became a defining feature of many strands of radicalism. One reason for that disenchantment was the contradiction between Enlightenment ideals and the reality of racism and colonialism. If Europe was responsible for the subjugation of half the world, many asked, what worth could there be in its political and moral ideals, which at best had failed to prevent that subjugation, at worst had provided its intellectual grounding? Non-Europeans, so critics argued, had to develop their own ideas, beliefs and values rooted in their own cultures and histories. These arguments would lay the ground for those challenging injustice and oppression to cleave to what we now call the politics of identity. From the earliest days of resistance to racism and colonialism, there were movements rooted in a racial or identitarian viewpoint. From 19th century back to Africa campaigns, to Garveyism and negritude in the 20th century. The ideas that guided these movements were often deeply reactionary. Marcus Garvey, like many black nationalists, opposed race mixing and regarded the Ku Klux Klan as better friends of the race than any other whites. For Leopold Senghor, one of the founders of negritude, black and white forms of thinking were distinct. European reasoning is analytical, discursive, he wrote. Negro-African reasoning is intuitive. It was a racialized view of cognition and values that played on racist tropes about blacks being intuitive and whites rational. And yet the relationship between universalism and identitarian views could also be more complex. Take the case of someone like C.L.R. James. Born in Trinidad in 1901, James is one of those towering figures of the 20th century who, like the revolution he so eloquently depicted, is all too rarely recognized as such. In the 1930s, James became a leading figure in both the Trotskyist and the Pan-Africanist movements. Now, these may not seem the most compatible of bedfellows, the one viewing social relations primarily through the lens of class, the other defining solidarity in racial terms. James himself was clear where he stood on this issue. The race question, he wrote, is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. It's a quote, it's a line from the Black Jacobins, in fact. So why was James drawn to Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism in the 1930s stitched together two distinct political outlooks. For what we might call the essentialists, there was an unbreakable thread running through the history and needs of the peoples of Africa. For the anti-capitalists, Pan-Africanism only had meaning in the struggles against imperialism and oppression, struggles defined by class as much as by race, and which could pit African against African as much as black against white. Over time, the tensions between these two worldviews have become increasingly less resolvable, and the kind of radical internationalism that James championed has become less plausible. Two developments fueled this process in the post-war world. The first was the emergence of culture rather than race as a lens through which discussions of human differences and similarities were refracted. In the wake of Nazism and the Holocaust, racial ideas that had dominated the pre-war world became discredited. Racism did not disappear, of course, but where ideas of racial superiority and of white supremacy had been largely unchallenged, uncontested within elite circles, now ideas of racial equality came to occupy the moral high ground. In the early 20th century, the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas and his students, people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, helped transform the concepts of race and culture. Influenced both by German Romanticism and liberal egalitarianism, and repelled by racial science, Boas drew upon the Herderian vision of a plurality of cultures and developed a new notion of culture that was functionally equivalent to that of race, except for not thinking of groups of people as inferior or superior, and in which the essence of a people was rooted in history rather than in biology. In the post-war world, ideas of human differences were remapped onto the terrain of culture, and we started talking about multiculturalism, ethnic pluralism. Those became the means and medium through which we looked at human differences. But remapped also were all the ambiguities and contradictions of Herder's ideas. Boas and his intellectual descendants helped construct the bridge through which the ghosts of racial thinking were smuggled into the body of cultural pluralism in the post-war world. The emergence of culture as a medium of social discussion about human differences meshed also with another key post-war development, the transformation of the working class and of the left's relationship to it. Culture came to replace not just race, but class too. The late 1950s saw the emergence of the new left, a loose association of groups and of individuals self-consciously opposed to the old left of the communist parties and trade unions. Where the old left had looked to the working class as a motor of change, the new left looked to the new social movements, Third World liberation movements, civil rights organisations, feminist groups, campaigns for gay rights. Where the old left had talked of class and sought to raise class consciousness, the new left talked of culture and sought to strengthen cultural identity. Then, in the late 1970s and 80s, came the erosion of the Keynesian post-war order and the rise of what we now call neoliberalism. The labour movement and trade unions were gravely weakened, the left lost political influence, and the possibilities of radical social transformation seemed to fade. Both these shifts, the replacement of race by culture and the erosion of class politics and of working class organisation, came to shape the rise of what we now see as radical identity politics. The struggle for black rights in America, and especially the Black Power movement, was highly influential in developing new ideas of identity and self-organisation. The success of the civil rights movement in overthrowing Jim Crow had raised expectations that black people's lives would truly change. But the quality of life for most black people, especially in the cities, deteriorated, and their experience of police brutality and a racist justice system became even more intolerable. Black nationalism became a major medium through which was expressed that sense of frustrated rage that many African Americans felt at what seemed to be betrayal by mainstream society and by the mainstream left. Like Pan-Africanism in the 1930s, Black Power in the 1960s stitched together two distinct political outlooks, the essentialist and the anti-capitalist. The radical edge of Black Power was given by organisations such as the Black Panthers and individuals such as Angela Davis. The dilemma with which they wrestled was that even though, someone like C.L.R. James and the radical Pan-Africanists of the 1930s, they rooted their worldview in a form of class politics, they also felt that racism was had run so deep in American society that the possibilities of black and white solidarity were all but illusory. That was a dilemma that only enhanced the other side of 60s Black Power, and one that is less recognised. It's conservatism. A conservatism that was expressed particularly in two themes. The first was an essentialist argument about group identity that can be traced back to Herder, the view of black people as a self-contained group with its own culture, values, and ways of living. In Africa, they speak of negritude, wrote Julius Lester, a leading figure in both in the civil rights and in the Black Power movements. It is a recognition of those things uniquely ours which separate us from the white man. According to Lester, the uniqueness of black culture was its emphasis on the non-verbal. It is the experience that counts, not what is said. An echo here of what Senghor had written 30 years previously. And in both cases, such claims not only drew on Herderian arguments about culture and difference, but often embraced racist tropes about African Americans as non-verbal. The second conservative theme was the celebration of black capitalism. As one delegate wrote of the first Black Power conference held in Newark, New Jersey in 1968, the general consensus of this gathering was that we need to transfer the economic power wielded by white men in the black ghettos to black men. Not tear down the ghettos or provide decent housing and conditions, but ensure that those who controlled and profited from them were black capitalists. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, anti-capitalism had become weaker and essentialism stronger, a shift that became far more pronounced over the next half-century, ensuring in a triumph of the conservative essentialist tendency. As the political philosopher Wendy Brown has put it, what we have come to call identity politics is partly dependent on the demise of a critique of capitalism. Through these changes, the meaning of belongingness and of solidarity transformed. An important distinction historically has been that between an inward-looking, binding politics of identity and the outward-looking, bridging politics of solidarity. The politics of identity mobilizes by emphasizing shared membership of a particular identity, be that gender, sexuality, race, or nation. The politics of solidarity also stresses collective endeavor, but views commonality as emerging not from particular identities, but out of a shared set of values and beliefs, and a struggle to win acceptance for those values and beliefs. The distinction is not always clear-cut. Elements of both coexist in many forms of collective politics. It is, however, the politics of solidarity that has crumbled over the past 3 decades as radical movements have declined and the power of organised labour has drained away. For many today, the only forms of collective politics that seems possible is that rooted in identity. The framework through which we make sense of our world is defined less as liberal or conservative or socialist than often as white or Muslim or English or European. The rise of identity politics has transformed not just notions of who we are and of how we relate to each other, but also our conception of what racism is. Racism has become reframed as white privilege. I want to argue that that reframing is a product not of reality, but of our obsession with identity, and an obstacle, not an aid, in the struggle against racism and racial categorization. Underlying the white privilege thesis are 2 basic claims. First, that white is a useful category in which to place everyone from Elon Musk to a cleaner in a Tesla factory. And second, that being in such a category imbues people with privileges denied to those not in that category. The idea that all those deemed white have a common identity and set of interests which conflict with those of non-whites is, of course, an argument long deployed by racists. It's a claim that most anti-racists would reject, recognizing that the interests of white factory workers or shelf stackers are not the same as those of white bankers or business owners, but far closer to those of black factory workers or Asian shelf stackers. Why ignore this, then, when it comes to the question of white privilege? Because, many argue, white people do not have to endure the discrimination suffered by non-whites by virtue of their skin colour. At one level, this is true. Projecting this in terms of white privilege is, however, flawed. First, it is not a privilege not to have to face discrimination or bigotry. It should be the norm. To describe as a privilege the fact that one is not being denied equal treatment is to turn the struggle for justice on its head. Second, the concept of white privilege fails to distinguish between the claim of not being discriminated against because of one's skin colour and the claim of having immunity from discrimination or bigotry because one is white. Many whites, because of privileges afforded by wealth and class, do have immunity against discrimination. But many others who are poor or working class do not. Their experiences of state authority, for instance, is often strikingly similar to that of non-whites. Consider, for instance, the issue of incarceration rates in America. America locks up more of its citizens than any other nation. African Americans have disproportionately borne the brunt of this brutality, they are 5 times as likely to be imprisoned as white Americans. Many view mass incarceration as the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander put it in the title of an influential book. Yet, the issue is more complex. Studies show that at any given income level, there's actually little difference between the incarceration rates of whites and blacks. But there are huge differences between income levels. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to be imprisoned, whatever your race. Studies also show that what has risen dramatically since the 1970s has been the incarceration rate among high school dropouts, while the rate among college graduates, black and white, has declined. In 2017, one study notes, a white high school dropout was about 15 times more likely to be in prison than a black college graduate. Now, it's true that because of racism, African Americans are disproportionately poor and working class. But that is not an argument to erase the fact that having white skin does not necessarily provide materially significant privilege, whereas being wealthy may do so, even if black. Similarly, with an even more explosive issue, that of disproportionate killings of African Americans by US police, the issue that led to the founding of Black Lives Matter movement and became part of a global debate. And last month, the brutal murder of Tyree Nichols by 5 black policemen in Memphis ignited a debate about white supremacy and about whether and how black officers have internalized it. Yet we don't have to tie ourselves in such knots. It is true that black Americans are at least twice as likely to be killed by police as whites. Paradoxically, though, that should not be seen simply in racial terms. Police violence is unsurprisingly correlated with poverty. The poorer a neighborhood, the greater the risk of an individual being killed by the police. More than half of those killed by US police are white. And studies show that someone poor and white is more likely to be killed by the police or face imprisonment than wealthy African Americans. Again, this is a story as much about class and of the policing of the poor as it is about race. To suggest that is not to deny racism or to fall into the trap of class reductionism, as some claim. It is simply not to wish away the complexities of the world. And without facing up to those complexities, it becomes impossible to fashion a strategy whether to oppose racism or to defend working class interests. The other side of the white privilege claim is the embrace of white identity, the insistence that all white people have a common identity or set of interests. It has become a means of rebranding racism in identitarian terms. Over the past 40 years, the marginalization of the working class has created in sections of the electorate a sense of anger and disaffection. That marginalization has been the product largely of economic, social, and political changes, the atomization of society, the growth of inequality, the erosion of trade union power, the transformation of social democratic parties away from their traditional working class constituencies, and so on. But many have come to see it, not in political or economic terms, but as a cultural loss. The very decline of the economic and political power of the working class has helped obscure the economic and political roots of social problems. And as culture has become the medium through which social issues are refracted, so many within the working class have also come to see their problems in cultural terms. They too have turned to the language of identity to express their discontent. As a language of class has given way to the language of culture, So class has come to be seen not as a political, but as a cultural, even racial attribute. Hence the notion of the white working class, in which whiteness seems more important than class. And all this has opened the door to the identity movement to the far right, which link a reactionary politics of identity rooted in hostility to migrants and Muslims to economic and social policies that once were the staple of the left: defense of jobs, support for the welfare state, opposition to austerity. The result is a new kind of mass politics and the refashioning of the original reactionary politics of identity, race, for a new age. At the same time, many far-right tropes, such as the Great Replacement, a conspiracy theory about the elites replacing indigenous Europeans with immigrants, and calls to resist the loss of the European homeland, have become common currency in mainstream conservative thinking. The American novelist Lionel Shriver believes that white Europeans are being forced to, and I quote, passively accept and even abet incursions by foreigners so massive that the native-born are effectively surrendering their territory without a shot fired. Or Douglas Murray, the associate editor of The Spectator, one of the most prominent conservatives in Britain today, fears that London has become a foreign country because white Britons are now in a minority, and he believes that the peoples of Europe will have lost the only place in the world we had to call home. These are far-right, straightforward far-right ideas, but which have now become common currency in mainstream conservative circles. The irony is that Murray and Shriver, like many conservatives, are fierce critics of identity politics, except when that identity happens to be white, and the problem, that of white decline. The mainstreaming of identity politics has allowed conservatives to give racism a new legitimacy by normalizing white identity, while at the same time criticizing the very politics they are embracing. Let me kind of sum up the argument I've been making. The concept of race emerged in the 18th century as the medium through which could be understood many of the contradictions of modernity. Most importantly, it made sense of and provided a justification for the persistence of inequalities and enslavement in societies that had proclaimed their fidelity to equality. The most cogent, deep-seated, far-reaching challenge to the concept of race came through the radical universalist tradition, a tradition that confronted both racism and the racialization of people, that is, both the practice of discrimination and the imposition of racial categories on people, often as a means of justifying such discrimination. The erosion of that tradition, that was that I've highlighted as being embodied in figures like C.L.R. James, the erosion of that tradition has created a social space that has come to be filled by the politics of identity. Human beings don't live in either the particular or the universal. All human beings define themselves both through their immediate rooted identities, a woman, an engineer, a Muslim, an FC Barcelona fan, and so on, and in terms of more universal aspirations. Those aspirations are framed by the character of politics and of social engagement. Humanity manifests itself in concrete local forms, and these are the starting point in understanding the more abstract concept of human universality. Equally, it is the more universal sense of being human that gives our local rooted identities context and meaning. What links the particular and the universal is the conscious activity through which humans make and remake the world through politics and art and social struggles. These allow us to transcend our immediate local identities and reach out and discover more universal forms of our humanness, not as abstract beliefs, but in concrete expressions of empathy and solidarity. From the Haitian Revolution to the suffragette movement, from organising rescue of migrants facing disaster at sea to campaigning for the Uyghurs in China. Our engagement with the world allows us to move beyond our immediate concerns and to place those concerns in a more expansive, more universal context. The opposite is also true. When politics seems frayed and social movements have disintegrated, the link between the local and the global, between the particular and the universal, becomes strained, even broken. Race and identitarian politics are a way of marginalizing the political, of insisting that rights, duties, and obligations flow not from one's beliefs and actions, but from one's being, whether that being is rooted in history or biology. It is a way of wrapping values and worth and ideals around particular identities. Let's go back to Frantz Fanon. My black skin, he wrote, is not the wrapping of specific values. His solidarity, he said, is not with those who share his identity or his skin colour, but with all those who shared his ideals and would defend the right and dignity of all people. To transcend race, to break the bounds of identity politics, requires us to resurrect that sense of radical universalism, not just as an idea, but also as a social movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenan. We have time for questions. You want them one by one or kind of cluster?
Whichever you prefer.
1, 2.
Thanks very much for fascinating talk. Can I just ask what you make of notions like intersectionality, which always seems to me to be a way of acknowledging empirical evidence of the cross-cutting of the different categories without affording any of them priority?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the great replacement because in the way that you've posed it, it does represent that sort of demographic mindset, which has been a long underpinning of racialised thinking. And, you know, race goes together with numbers as part of, you know, the fear, if you like. But there's also a sort of, in inverted commas, progressive version of that, which, I mean, I noticed my research is on generations, and I remember reading this report a few years ago by the Pew Research Centre in America, where they produced a report called Millennials, America's Demographic Bridge to the Future. And it was about how, with this generation, it will be the first kind of majority non-white generation. And I hear versions of this argument quite a lot, you know, this sort of idea that it's a really great thing that you're going to have this kind of... And then, of course, it creates a backlash. And I just wondered how you navigate that, because it seems to me actually to be the same argument and very reactionary in both ways.
Okay. I'll come back to you. So we have a third question, and then we'll take on to Ty.
Thank you. So just as you concluded on that argument around universalism, it made me wonder what your thoughts are on kind of current and recent and emerging theories around pluriversalism.
Should we take those?
Yeah. Let's start with intersectionality first. It seems to me that what the problem with intersectionality arguments is that it begins with the with the acceptance of fixed identities and says how can they relate to each other. And that seems to me the wrong starting point. Rather than saying, let's move, it's not a way of moving from the local to the global, from the particular to universal. It is saying, how can the different local identities relate to each other? And I prefer the second. I think any movement that is progressive in my way of thinking has to ask not how can local identities simply refer to each other or relate to each other, but how can we move from local identities to a more universal sense of what it is to be human. On the great replacements and kind of left-wing versions of it, I don't see them as left-wing versions of the great replacement theory. I think they're two very different things. Nevertheless, I think what they have in common is a replacement of politics by demography. I think that's, and that can take many different forms. And it's true that that many on the left now look to demographic change as the means of providing political transformation, rather than look for political transformation itself, irrespective of the demography of the people concerned. I think it's that focus on demography which is fatal to any political conception of social change. On plurality, I mean, in a sense, it goes back to what I was saying about intersectionality, that there is the questions we need to ask ourselves is not how do different groups relate to each other, but how do we relate the local to the global. And I think that's the question that we seem to have lost.
Thank you for your talk. I just want to ask a follow-up question on intersectionality, because I don't understand intersectionality to be about the relation between the global and the local, but is about different kinds of oppression that people might be subject to at different moments. So there is gender, there is class, there is sexuality, there is race. So why dismissing it so easily when in fact it points to oppression and exploitation, which is so central to class too, and class struggle?
So we have Lynn and then one more. I'll come back to you. This is very good. It's a good spread for our burn calories. Hi, Lynn. Shall I? Sorry.
First of all, thank you very much for that brilliant lecture. And I want to say I agree, I think, with just about everything you say. And yet there is, I think, a problem in terms of dismissing identity politics completely. I taught at a black college in Alabama in the 60s when black power was at its height. And the students I taught had often been simply taken on board racism as part of their identity. That is, they believed they were inferior, they believed that they were ugly, they believed that they lacked. And identity politics in their case allowed them to begin to feel that they were not all those things. So I'm not sure how one deals with that. I too am convinced that the issue is class rather than race. But nevertheless, at a very local and individual level, racism is something that seems to me can only be counteracted by a specific counter-racism almost.
Yeah, thanks very much. One of the kind of big terms or doctrines that obviously in the UK context bring culture and racial politics together is multiculturalism. So I know you've written about this before a little bit, but I was just wondering, what kind of role do you see the kind of the celebration of multiculturalism playing in this narrative that you set out? And has it, over the last 10, 15 years, disappeared, or has that kind of celebratory doctrine been just kind of normalised, especially in the kind of current government, the cabinet that we have today?
Okay, let's start going back to this discussion of intersectionality, or the question about intersectionality. It seems to me that what intersectionality, what it does is provides a description of the world as it is. That's fair enough. It's telling us about those different forms in which discrimination, bigotry, and oppression can take place. But having a description is not the same as having either a prescription or a means of moving beyond it. That seems to me the problem in all the discussions about intersectionality and all the debate about intersectionality. That seems to me the issue. And that's why I was stressing the difference between the fact that at a local level we can define and see and accept and acknowledge the different kinds of oppressions that there are, and the need to struggle against all of them, but also that is different from asking how do we move from the local set of issues and oppressions to a more universal sense of what we need to do in order to transform society. It kind of leads to the second question, which is about isn't it important to hold on to identities in a sense, and isn't specific anti-racist movements and struggles important? Both of them. I'm very much of the opinion that anti-racist movements are necessary. I've been part of anti-racist movements for more than 30 years. But the issue isn't whether we should have... let's step back a bit. There's a difference between identity and identity politics. Identities are crucially important to all of us. They're what gives us grounding in the world, allows us to relate to others, to give a sense of ourselves in relation to others. But politics should be a means of transcending those particularities in which we all find ourselves and through which we all see ourselves and we see others. Give a personal example. I was drawn into politics because of my experience of racism. I grew up in a Britain that was very, very different from Britain of today, where a Britain where racism was, visceral and vicious. Firebombing, stabbings were almost daily, weekly events. But if it was racism that drew me into politics, it was politics that allowed me to see beyond racism, beyond the injustice done to me, beyond my specific identity and my specific oppression. And I was able to do that, not because I was particularly clever or whatever, but because the organizations, the movements that existed when I was growing up, which in some senses could be seen as identitarian organizations, the Asian youth movements, for instance, or the Indian Workers' Association, but which were, in effect, much broader, global movements that sought to move beyond the question of identity. When I was growing up, black was not an identitarian term, wasn't an ethnic term. It was a political term. I was black. I still think of myself as black, because blackness defines a political term, not an identitarian term. Of course, no one, if I say to anyone, I am black, nobody will understand. People will laugh at me today, because the whole context in which we think about identity and the politics of identity has changed so much. And so the point I'm making is that we need first to distinguish between identity and the politics of identity. And that the question and the questions we ask is not, and that to be critical of identity politics is not to be critical of anti-racism or anti-racist movements. It is rather, the debate is not should we or should we not combat racism. It is how should we combat racism? What are the organizations, what are the arguments, what are the means and methods we need to do so? So it's very important to not to see it as a dismissal of anti-racism, but rather as an argument for a kind of anti-racism, but one that can successfully overcome the kinds of fissures and divisions that create racism in the first place. Finally, on this question of multiculturalism, I think we need to make a distinction between, for want of better words, multiculturalism and diversity. One of the arguments, one of the interesting things about multiculturalism is that how the critique has changed over the past 20 or 30 years. In that, for me, the critique of multiculturalism goes hand in hand with a defense of mass immigration. But over the past 20, 30 years, the critique of multiculturalism has gone hand in hand with the critique of immigration. And it seems to me they're confusing what it is, because we confuse two things. One is diversity and the creation of a more diverse cosmopolitan society, which is a good. Immigration is a good in that sense. The other is multiculturalism, which is to define people by certain identities, put them in certain boxes, and to define certain racial, cultural, ethnic, faith boxes, and to define their needs and identities and aspirations by the boxes into which they've been put. That's why I'm critical of multiculturalism. It's because it's the opposite of what's good about diversity. What's good about diversity is that it allows us to broaden our horizons, to think beyond the box or the particularities or the identities that we have, to engage with other people, with other identities, ideas, visions, ideals. And through that, to create a more common language of citizenship. Whereas multiculturalism, by putting people into boxes and thinking of people as having different needs and aspirations because of the boxes into which they've been put, actually makes that kind of the value of diversity, it dilutes the value of diversity. It in fact, eviscerates the value of diversity. And that's why I'm critical of it. And no, it hasn't gone away. We don't talk about multiculturalism in the way we used to. But then, the terms have changed. In the 90s, we talked about the politics of difference. Then we talked about multiculturalism. Now we talk about the politics of identity. But they're all referring to much the same thing. And it is that much the same thing, what I've been talking about, of which I'm critical and to which I'm opposed. Hope that makes sense to answer the question, ask the question.
So there was one there, and I'm coming to you. So I'll take two here. Come back.
Thanks, Kenan, for all these comments on this kind of bag of things that are much the same thing. I wondered if you had any thoughts on lived experience as a term that you would also put into that bag. It's come to be that which we're supposed to recognise, venerate, organise our research around, be especially preoccupied with now. Do you see that as being connected to this phenomenon of us only ever being able to see each other as different rather than similar, and therefore having something in common with this rise of identity?
Thanks, Kenan, for a really sort of inspiring talk. In terms of sort of cultural rejection is a survival mechanism for many against racism. How do you think that fits in terms of the concept of identity?
How do you define cultural rejection?
Assimilation.
Right.
There's, we can take them together. I'll come back. So we'll do 4 this time. Mix it up a little. Hi.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. How do you define culture?
So they left the easy ones till the end.
Thank you. Kenan, apologies, this is not going to be very well formulated. I've found your talk fascinating. I'm still processing it. But there's something about what you said, particularly in relation to your responses to questions, where I'm sort of going, oh, I'm not quite so sure about that. So you talk about the importance of universalism, which to me sounds great. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you there. But then you keep talking about global. And I'm almost sort of hearing global citizen. And then you talk about diversity as in a way in which it's almost a good in and of itself. And then I'm sort of conjuring up an image of it is the sort of way to go to have the world nations of people equally diverse. And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but there's something within what you're saying where I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. Actually, the sort of, if you like, the experience of a community, of a nation, is actually quite significant. And so when we talk about minority white cities in the UK, as was in relation to Birmingham, Manchester and London in the latest census data, it seems that there is actually something there to discuss. And to want to discuss that and try and get your head round it doesn't mean that you're not necessarily of a universalistic outlook. Certainly doesn't mean that you're racist in my book. But it seems that there is actually something quite important there to discuss.
Yeah. Okay. Let me begin with that, because it's a quite interesting argument. Why should the fact that London is 45% white rather than 55% white make any difference? Why should a community define itself by its skin colour? Why should that skin colour be the definition of what is good for that community? Why should one's skin colour be the means by which one has one's relationship to everything else that's important to one? It seems to me that the idea that skin colour becomes important in this context confuses 2 things. One is that communities are important. Communities are clearly important. But those communities don't have to be all white or majority white for them to act as communities, or for them to act, to allow one to belong to have to something that's bigger than yourself, which is another way of talking about communities. It seems to me to confuse what is important in the idea of communities with what is trivial and often quite dangerous in how we define communities, and nations for that matter. Seems to me the fact that Britain is less white than it was 50 years ago should have no bearing on what we think is good or bad about Britain, or the kinds of values that we want to pursue in Britain. What, for me, solidarity, community, is not about do they have the same, does this person have the same skin color or ethnicity or even religion as I do. It is about how can I relate to them as another human being, and how can I relate to them in a way that allows me to pursue a set of values that I think are important for all of us. It's a confusion of values and questions of race and ethnicity, values and peoples in that sense. That seems to me the problem. Going back to this thing about cultural rejection, which I take it you mean when you talk about assimilation. Are you asking is or is not assimilation a good thing? Is that what you were?
I guess as a defence mechanism, sort of so you integrate yourself into society to an extent where you do reject your cultural roots, and that's trying to blend in. This is what I guess my parents when they first came to this country tried to do very unsuccessfully.
But I suppose there are a number of points again there. Cultures, one doesn't simply lose one's culture, because culture is, in any sense, is what people are doing at that moment with relation to other people. Culture isn't something fixed that you can kind of lose, you can throw away or lose. Culture describes a set of relationships that we have with each other in the present and with particular histories and heritages. But it's a relationship that defines a community, not something fixed that one can lose or erase or and so on. So the question we're asking is, when somebody who migrates and is, how do both the communities into which they go to and they themselves, how do they relate to each other? And this goes back to the point about making diversity, which somebody took umbrage at. The point I'm making is that it is that difference between the two is what allows us to have a dialogue, to think about each other's ways of doing things, and to be able to create through that a more universal sense of citizenship, of a more universal sense of what we have in common. And that's why diversities are good, because if we were all the same, we wouldn't be able to have that discussion and debate. And it is in having that discussion and debate that our ability to find out what we have in common as well as what we have differently, and how my values and beliefs may evolve, change, improve through a collision with other people's values and beliefs. That is, to me, seems what is important, and what is important about diversity. Finally, on lived experience. Yes, I think the problem with the idea of lived experience is that when we raise lived experience, it's not lived experience in and of itself, it is elevating lived experience above other things as being the metric by which we judge something to be right or good, and so on. Lived experience can be good. I mean, it is good. I mean, it's just our different experiences of the world. Those different experiences of the world provide the raw material for us to engage with each other. But if we see them as more than simply the raw material, if we see them as some metric of what is right or good, that's where the problem is. And that's what notions of lived experience have become these days. That they are in some way, one's lived experience gives you some special insight. It doesn't. One's lived experience gives you special insight to your lived experience. But it also allows you to engage and debate and discuss and expand by having that engagement and discussion with people of other lived experiences. And it seems to me that that's what matters.
So unless there's like a burning question. Does it look like a burning question? So we stick one more?
Okay.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk about lived experience, but I work in the NHS, and there's this sense of identity, but we still have these micro separations. And I just wondered, from a translating into real life, actually, what does this mean? How do I go back to my organisations and say, yes, we have a joint identity, we all have a common purpose, but actually, how do I incorporate this in a practical term?
Can you give an example? What are you talking about?
So I'm a GP.
Yeah.
I sit on the ICB board, and we had a really interesting conversation and a presentation from a Sikh faith group.
Yeah.
And across the board, we've got lots of partner organisations, and we're talking about collaboration, and it's all about the NHS, social care, and a common goal and common values. What was really interesting was we had a Sikh guy give us a presentation, and one of the lived experiences was a 98-year-old Sikh gentleman who was in hospital, couldn't see his family in the middle of COVID, and his hair and his beard were cut, which is against Sikh religion. So actually, we've got this common purpose going on up here. I have this conversation many times, but what is happening on the ground is very different. And I think there's a set of ideologies, but how do we enact those ideologies is my pushback.
I'm not sure why that should be an argument against what I've been saying. To do something that is personally that cut a Sikh patient's hair and beard, it's wrong in that context. But that doesn't mean that that one should elevate lived experience above anything else. That's just saying that one respects people and their dignity and tries to afford them as great a dignity as possible within the circles that we can. That's different from saying that, therefore, the lived experience is more important or becomes the measure of how we do things. The voice of lived experience becomes the voice that we listen to rather than anything else. That lived experience is important for that individual person. It's not important, in a sense, or necessarily important for a wider sense of what we want in society, what we want in the NHS. Respecting people, giving them dignity, is important in the NHS as it is in society. That's not the same as saying we elevate lived experience above other things.
One last.
Thank you very much for a really compelling talk. You mentioned the term citizenship a couple of times as if that's unproblematic, but it's not unproblematic.
I agree.
One of the major binaries in the contemporary moment is between the citizen and non-citizen. So I wondered if you could just say a bit more about how the term citizen and citizenship fits in this history that you're telling.
Yes, I mean, I'm fully aware that the idea of citizenship and what it entails and who it excludes is very problematic, and there's a kind of long history of that. I'm not sure I can, in a minute or two, kind of go dig deeply into that. I do think, however, that the idea of citizenship is both important in the sense that it allows for the creation and the establishment of democratic politics, and problematic because of the way it excludes people from rights and processes. That, I think, is it's another debate which I'm not sure I can do justice in at the current moment. But yes, you're right that it's not a problematic notion. It's not an unproblematic notion or category.
Kenan, thank you very much for doing this.